The Central European art scene of the second half of the 20th century was a dynamic organism. The trends, strategies, and situation of artists and art institutions changed so rapidly that we are still putting together the pieces of this chaotic mosaic. In comparison with the continuous, well-knit, regular rhythm of changes in the West, the East was characterized by passages marked presto, followed by periods of an intolerable lento. The situation was complicated still further by the fact that these rhythms were not synchronized within the individual cultures of the ex-Soviet bloc. The differences between the Czech and Slovak art scenes within the united Czechoslovakia are a good example. In order to overcome the difficulties in defining these complex relations, I would like to focus on the concept of place and its role in both the creation and presentation of the artwork. I want to put forward an alternative art history of the place and underscore the different situation of artists in the West and in the former East, or former West and former East. I start with the observation that though individual artworks either side of the Iron Curtain may be comparable, as soon as we broaden our analysis to include exhibition histories and the exhibition trajectories of individual artists, a significant gap opens up. I will argue that this gap is the reason why still today so few artists from Central and Eastern Europe are part of global art history. And if they are, they still often play a marginalized role despite the strength of their work. I will point to the specific places where art was created and presented and peel away the layers, be these social, political, urbanistic. I propose extending the horizontal art history of Piotr Piotrowski to include a non-invasive archaeological methods of the type discussed by the Norwegian theoretician Christian Norberg Schulz, for example. Different types of places, such as private apartments, corridors, cellars, and attics, tennis courts, fields, and many other unusual public spaces can be found on the map. Why did artists choose them, and what did these places mean to them? How might we perceive them from today's perspective, when their unrepresentative character often clashes with the recognition these artworks and artists were accorded in the local art histories? I would like to begin my contribution with an exhibition that took place in the Václav Špála Gallery in 1969. This was exactly one year after the Soviet occupation, which marked a turning point in the history of Czechoslovakia. The exhibition was both an echo of the unprecedentedly liberal 60s, but also a portent of the period of normalization just beginning, during which the atmosphere in society and the suppression exerted by the regime returned almost to the levels of the 50s. Two married couples were represented at this exhibition called Somewhere Something. Jiří Kolář and his wife, the almost unknown Běla Kolářová, and the young Zorka Ságlová and her husband, the photographer Jan Ságl. Exhibiting tacky gingerbread hearts, Easter lamp cakes, and hay and straw at what was at that time the most prestigious gallery in Prague was a radical gesture. In his introductory text, the exhibition curator, Jiří Padrta, drew attention to the latest trends, stressing that along with the new realists and pop artists, the artist no longer wants simply to evoke reality, but to create art by means of reality itself. End of quote. He also made reference to the legendary exhibition When Attitudes Become Form, curated by Harald Seemann, which had been held in the spring of that year at the Kunsthalle Bern. He also mentioned happenings, the Arte Povera movement and land art, the last of which was a characteristic feature of Ságlová's work, along with the documentary photography of her events exhibited by her husband. I shall analyze this unique event in more detail at the conference State Reconstruction and Art in Central and Eastern Europe in Warsaw this November. Here I will use it more as the starting point of my thoughts regarding the situation in Czechoslovakia during 70s and 80s. The most salient feature of the time was the impossibility of exhibiting under normal conditions in the gallery. Jiří Kolář had admittedly had few opportunities to exhibit abroad, though the work of his wife remained virtually unseen through the 70s. Zorka Ságlová located her activities to the countryside, where she was free to realize her events without interference on the part of state security service. We can see this in two events held in 1970. Czechoslovak conceptualists and action artists got around the unfavorable conditions of the 70s by means of privately organized events held in the countryside, apartments and cellars, or via mail art. They also continued in the tradition of street art as practiced by Milan Knížák and Alex Mlynarczyk, who also quit the city during the 70s. For instance, in 1970, Mlynarczyk organized a snow festival at which Slovak artists offered their take on land art. Ságlová, Želibská, and many others relocated to the countryside, and the first body art events took place in natural surrounding, free of surveillance. The three Prague-based body artists, Petr Štembera, Jan Mačoch, and Karel Miller, began organizing regular evening performances in the premises of the convent of St. Agnes, the cellar of Museum of Decorative Arts, and other alternative semi-private spaces. Availing themselves of the mail art network, Czech and Slovak conceptualists exhibited in Poland and Hungary, as well as in the USA, Holland, and other countries. They sent documentation of their events around the world by post. However, when Karel Miller decided to organize a solo exhibition, his first and last retrospective, he had no choice but to hold it in the apartment of his friend, the philosopher Petr Rezek. And here I come to the heart of the problem I wish to address today. Excuse me. From today's perspective, how could this apartment exhibition compete with the similar retrospectives of Western artists in established galleries? Of course, the latter also worked in the countryside and alternative spaces and exhibited in lofts and disused shops. However, they gradually worked their up through private non-profit institutions to prestigious galleries and museums. Either this was simply impossible for artists working behind the Iron Curtain, or in the best case scenario, their career path was one of senseless fits and starts. Julius Koller, Adriana Šimotová, and Stanislav Kolíbal are good examples of this. At a time when Western artists were deconstructing the modernist ideal of a white cube, their Eastern counterparts would have counted themselves lucky to set foot in one. At present, when museology and the art history of curatorship are interrogating the context within which works are exhibited, this is a crucial point. As Brian O'Doherty writes, quote, "The ideal gallery subtracts from the artwork all cues that interfere with the fact that it is art." End of quote. With the exception of a few brief periods during which the rules were relaxed in former Soviet bloc, this luxury was reserved exclusively for official artists. How were artists from the East supposed to deal with this historical handicap? As I have said, conceptualists and action artists made the most of the situation. Either they deployed humor as when Slovak artist Petr Meluzin transformed a down-at-heel socialist Luxus into Fluxus, or they refashioned the existential burden of life under totalitarianism into a timeless statement on the human condition, after which they sent a report via mail art around the world. In the case of more traditionally minded artists, painter or sculptor, the situation was more complicated. Paintings and sculptures could not be sent by post to exhibitions abroad, and there were limited opportunities to exhibit in apartments and cellars. Nevertheless, the urge to display their work did not go away. And so creative professionals excluded from official galleries increasingly resorted to what had until then either been second-tier, marginalized exhibition spaces set aside for amateurs and special interest groups, or had simply not existed. The foyers of theaters and culture centers, the corridors of research institutions, as well as non-gallery premises, such as private apartments, courtyards, etc., became much sought-after places of refuge. This in turn raises the profile of such places, and many previously unheard-of galleries suddenly acquired an important status on the art scene. If you look at the list of exhibitions of, for example, Adriana Šimotová, we gain an insight in the distortion and paradoxes involved. During the 70s and 80s, Šimotová occasionally exhibited abroad, mostly her drawings, so she was able to send them by mail. During the 70s, in 1981, she had a solo exhibition at the 16th International Biennale of Graphic Art in Ljubljana. Yet, in Czechoslovakia, she was only able to exhibit in the foyer of the Theatre of Music in Olomouc in 1978, after which her work was displayed in several other highly marginalized venues. Her work only entered the hallowed confines of an established gallery in 1983, when she was permitted to exhibit at the Summer Palace in Ostrov nad Ohří, a peripheral venue that was difficult to get to. During the 80s, Šimotová compensated for the impossibility of any normal presentation of her work, gallery presentation of her work, at the former Franciscan monastery in Hostine, where she found space and inspiration and was able, thanks to her network of friends, to exhibit regularly, albeit on the private basis. It was here, buoyed up by Genius Loci of the monastery, that she created her best works. Though her exhibitions could be seen by only a small number of people. These included the top art theoreticians and historians, as well as well-known artists who had no hesitation in traveling to a remote location for a preview. Similar stories are associated with other Czech and Slovak post-war artists. There's no doubt that the situation caused great frustration to artists behind the Iron Curtain. We sense this in a letter written by Stanislav Kolíbal to Milan Weber, organizer of exhibitions of artists lacking official support, in a foyer of the House of Culture in Orlova, not far from Ostrava. In other words, on the periphery of the periphery. And here I quote from Stanislav Kolíbal's letter. In the situation when he was asked to exhibit at this venue. This is purely my personal opinion, and I admit I might be mistaken. But I believe it's not right if you accept a space that's offered simply because you don't have another one elsewhere, because you have been refused it, Okay, so a catalog is produced, an organizer slaves away diligently, and friends travel from afar to the opening in order to demonstrate their friendship and solidarity with the plight of the artist. But at the same time, there is a kind of two-pronged negative impact, which is what concerns me the most. The artist is reinforced in his belief that there is no other space available to him, which is completely damaging. But the union of fine artists or other such an organ can celebrate, since they have the artist just where they wanted him, backed into a corner. That's why I ask so often, what is one to do? Because if you turn down the small venues, you're falling into their trap. You're forced into isolation. And Kolibal concludes, I prefer the lesser of two evils. Isolation of myself chose. Through the 70s, Stanislav Kolibal basically worked only in his studio and had no opportunity to exhibit in public. The outcome was an exceptional and unprecedentedly concentrated series of site-specific installations, like this one. However, many artists accepted the situation for what it was and reconciled themselves to exhibiting whether they could, whether this entailed exhibiting their work in courtyards in the center of Prague, putting together the exhibition gathering on the pretext of decorating tennis courts, the most absurd place you can imagine, or organizing a land art symposium at the Hop Garden in Mutiovice. Many important painters and sculptors who are now the pride of our National Gallery found themselves in the unusual situation of having to react to the spaces on offer and resolve all the attendant problems of site-specific art. In doing so, they indirectly expanded their repertoire by techniques that were being widely discussed in the West at the time. Unfortunately, instead of more generous offers following in from progressive universities, private galleries, and large institutions following in the wake of these defiant exhibitions, as would happen in the West, Eastern artists were more likely to find themselves subject to police repression. All three exhibitions referred to above were liquidated by the police, and their organizers and participants investigated, some even prosecuted. How might these injustices be remedied today? How could the disadvantages suffered by art shown in cellars, fields, and the foyers of communist culture centers and apartments be turned into advantage? How might one show that the exhibitions held in these spaces were not simply experiments at the start of the career, but the calculated presentations of artists deprived of opportunities to show their work in galleries? I believe that the only way is to grant equal status to these places in art history, and to understand that several of the resulting works would never have been created under normal conditions. The history of art of the later half of the 20th century is the history of exhibitions. And we are only now beginning to write this history in the East. Some random examples: the project organized by Hungarian branch of Transit entitled Parallel Chronologies, an archive of East European exhibitions, or documentation of established galleries like the work done by Zacheta. At the Research Center at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, we are putting the finishing touches to a project entitled The Medium of the Exhibition in Czech Art from 1957 to 1997. Everywhere, there is a need to analyze carefully the circumstances surrounding the selection of the venue. its role in the interpretation of the works on show, and what effects such condition had on the works themselves. We can change our viewpoint as Petr Melusine changed Luxus into Fluxus and Fluxus into Luxus, or Bob and Roberta Smith changed East to West and West to East. One thing is for sure, and that is that we must follow the same path as suggested by Julie Rice, for instance, in her book From Margin to the Center, in which she plots the exciting development of installation art from radical art form realized in alternative spaces into mainstream art supported by leading museum and gallery institutions. A similar trajectory, according to which new alternative procedures and places come to occupy the center of art attention, is mapped out by Mivon Kwon in One Place After Another. We must stop being ashamed of the shortcomings of the places in which art was exhibited during communism, and instead see them as equal or even superior to the white cube. I would like to illustrate just how difficult this will be with an example from Czechoslovak art history, an exhibition of the drawings. I'm coming to the conclusion. An exhibition of the drawings of Margita Titlová, which is unofficially organized in the burnt-out Fair Trade Palace, in the very place where the National Gallery now stands and in which many of the masterpieces from her collections are exhibited. Just to really show you, it's exactly the same place. This is not to sideline the existence of second-tier galleries or non-gallery institutions, but on the contrary, to highlight their unique context. This can by no means be taken for granted. For instance, other outstanding figures of Czech art scene, such as Stanislav Kolíbal and Václav Boštík, exhibited at Petr Rezek's apartment. Yet neither of these artists include this in their list of exhibitions. We therefore have to whittle away at the entrenched attitudes of both artists and above all art historians, who have unknowingly accepted these prejudices. The place is the key to unlocking many hitherto dormant circumstances surrounding the creation of artworks. It allows us to ask new questions and receive new answers. Eastern European artists always unconsciously sought to relate to events in the art world the other side of the Iron Curtain. And the frustration they experience at the restrictions placed upon them and the impossibility of mounting a proper exhibition, traveling, and freely obtaining information regarding the latest developments was only natural. Only the current emancipation of the countries of former Eastern Bloc and a globalized perspective will allow us recess our position within a broader context. We must continue the work begun by Piotr Piotrowski and extend the horizontal history of art in other directions. I personally, I would propose a non-invasive archaeological method that would analyze specific places and their juncture of cultural trajectories, as I did in my book, Walk Through Prague, in which I located all the known performances which took place in Prague from 1949 to 1989. This method, which I have provisionally entitled An Art History of the Place, might well seek inspiration in the phenomenological approach of Norbert Schulz. In his view, a place is a total phenomenon, dynamic system that cannot be reduced to any of its properties. The contemporary philosophy of place takes its cue from the theories of Lefebvre, formulated in the 70s and most eloquently propounded in La Production de l'Espace. Lefebvre made clear the crucial role of space as a social construct that at the same time is an instrument of hegemony. In today's globalized and digitalized world, the specific place might represent a way out of the current crisis. The place in which we stand determines an angle of our view. Indeed, this very conference, this brilliant conference, is eloquent proof of that fact. Thank you.